The year was 1963. The most powerful crime boss in Harlem walked through the marble corridors of the J. Edgar Hoover building like he owned the place. Bumpy Johnson's footsteps echoed against the walls as federal agents stared in disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. Nobody just walked into FBI headquarters and demanded to see the director. Nobody except Bumpy. The receptionist's hand trembled as she picked up the red phone. "Sir, Ellsworth Johnson is here. He says he has an appointment with Director Hoover." Through the frosted glass door, a shadow moved. The most feared man in federal law enforcement was about to meet the most respected man in Harlem's underworld. But to understand what happened in that room, and why it changed the course of organized crime forever, you need to go back 6 months earlier, to a cold February night when everything started falling apart. The Genovese family had been moving into Harlem for weeks. They thought the old man was finished. They thought wrong. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just another street hustler who'd gotten lucky. At 60 years old, he'd survived everything the streets could throw at him. Prison, betrayal, wars that left bodies scattered from 125th Street to the Hudson River. But this was different. This time they weren't just coming for his territory. They were coming for his legacy. Vincent the Chin Gigante had sent word through the usual channels. The message was simple. The old Negro's time is up. Harlem belongs to us now. Most men would have started a war. Most men would have called their soldiers, loaded their guns, and painted the streets red. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't most men. He'd learned something in all those years behind bars that his enemies never understood. Violence was the language of the weak. Intelligence was the weapon of kings. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday. Bumpy's numbers runner, a kid named Marcus who'd been working the same corner for 3 years, didn't show up for collection. When Bumpy's lieutenant found him, Marcus was hanging from a fire escape on Lenox Avenue. No note, no explanation, just a message written in blood. The second sign came a week later. 3 of Bumpy's policy banks were hit simultaneously. Professional jobs, clean, efficient, the kind of operation that spoke of serious money and serious planning. But they'd made one mistake. They'd left witnesses. Mrs. Eleanor Washington had been sweeping her stoop when the black Cadillacs pulled up. She'd seen the faces. She'd heard the voices. And most importantly, she'd recognized the voice giving orders from inside the lead car. That wasn't no Harlem accent, she told Bumpy, her weathered hands gripping her coffee cup like a lifeline. That was downtown money. Federal money. Bumpy sat in the back booth of Small's Paradise, the jazz club that had been his second home for 20 years. The music played, the crowd laughed, but his mind was working, calculating, planning. The Genovese family was powerful, but they weren't smart enough to plan these hits alone. They had help. Federal help. Someone was feeding them information. Someone was telling them exactly where to strike and when. His consigliere, Frank Lucas, slid into the booth across from him. "Word is they got files on everyone, Bump. Names, addresses, bank accounts. They know everything." "Not everything," Bumpy said quietly, his fingers drumming against the table. "They know what they've been told, but they don't know what they haven't been told." For 3 decades, Bumpy Johnson had survived by being 3 steps ahead of everyone else. While other bosses fought with bullets, he fought with information. While they made enemies, he made allies. And his most valuable ally wasn't someone you could find in any street corner or speakeasy. His most valuable ally wore a badge. Special Agent Sarah Chen had been working organized crime for the FBI for 8 years. She was brilliant, ambitious, and completely invisible to the old boys network that ran federal law enforcement. She was also Bumpy's daughter. Not by blood, by choice. Bumpy had found her when she was 16, living in a Chinatown alley after her parents died in a factory fire. He'd given her a home, an education, and a future. He'd also given her the one thing that made her invaluable in her federal career: the ability to think like the criminals she was hunting. Sarah had been feeding Bumpy information for years, not about ongoing investigations. She wasn't dirty. But about federal strategy, about which families were being targeted, about which agents could be trusted and which ones couldn't. And 3 weeks ago, She'd told him something that changed everything. "They're planning something big," she'd said during one of their monthly dinners in Chinatown. "A task force. Hoover himself is involved. They want to clean up Harlem, but they're not starting with you." "Who then?" "Everyone else. They're going to let the Italians move in. Let them do the dirty work. Then sweep them up when the smoke clears. You're supposed to be the last man standing, Bump. Then they'll come for you with clean hands." It was brilliant, diabolical, and it might have worked on anyone else. But Bumpy Johnson had been playing chess while his enemies were still learning checkers. The night before he walked into FBI headquarters, Bumpy made 3 phone calls. The first was to Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., the most powerful black politician in America. The second was to a reporter at the Amsterdam News who owed him a favor. The third was to J. Edgar Hoover's private line. "Mr. Director," Bumpy had said in his cultured, educated voice, the voice that surprised people who expected street slang, "I believe we need to talk. I have information that might interest you. Information about a federal agent who's been selling secrets to organized crime families." There had been silence on the other end. Then, "Mr. Johnson, I believe we do need to talk." Now, as Bumpy sat in the waiting room of the FBI director's office, he could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. In his jacket pocket was a manila envelope containing photographs, bank records, and tape recordings that would destroy 3 federal agents, 2 judges, and half the Genovese family's operations in New York. But that wasn't the real weapon. The real weapon was sitting behind the desk in the next room, probably wondering how a crime boss had managed to schedule an appointment with the most powerful law enforcement officer in America. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Johnson, the director will see you now." Bumpy stood, straightened his tie, and walked toward the door that would either save his empire or destroy it forever. But as he reached for the handle, he smiled. Because J. Edgar Hoover had no idea that the man he was about to meet had been playing a game that started long before this moment. J. Edgar Hoover didn't look up when Bumpy Johnson entered his office. The director sat behind his massive mahogany desk, reading a file that was probably thicker than most phone books. The silence stretched for 30 seconds, then a minute. It was a power play older than politics itself. Bumpy didn't take the bait. He stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind his back, studying the man who'd built the FBI into America's most feared law enforcement agency. The office was exactly what you'd expect from someone who collected secrets for a living. Dark wood, heavy curtains, photographs of Hoover shaking hands with presidents, senators, and Supreme Court justices. But what caught Bumpy's attention wasn't the power on display. It was what wasn't there. No family photos, no personal touches, no humanity. "Ellsworth Raymond Johnson," Hoover finally said, still not looking up. "Born October 31st, 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina. Moved to Harlem in 1919. First arrest 1921 for armed robbery. Sentenced to 10 years in Sing Sing, served 8. He flipped a page. Released 1929. Immediately went to work for Stephanie St. Clair, the so-called numbers queen of Harlem. By 1932, you'd taken over her operation. By 1935, you controlled every policy bank from the Bronx to Brooklyn." Another page. 1936. Sentenced to 15 years for drug trafficking. Served 11 at Alcatraz. Released 1947. And immediately resumed control of Harlem's underworld. Current estimated annual income $2 million. Hoover finally looked up. His pale blue eyes were the color of winter ice. "Did I miss anything, Mr. Johnson?" "You missed the important part," Bumpy said calmly. "Which is, I'm not here because I'm in trouble. I'm here because you are." For the first time in 30 years of federal service, J. Edgar Hoover looked genuinely surprised. Then his expression hardened into something that had made grown men confess to crimes they hadn't committed. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Johnson?" "No, sir. I'm trying to save your career." Bumpy reached into his jacket. 3 federal agents moved toward their weapons. Bumpy moved slowly, deliberately, and pulled out the manila envelope. "Agent Patricia Kellerman, badge number 4471, Bumpy said, placing the envelope on Hoover's desk. Assigned to Organized Crime Task Force, salary $4,200 a year. Also on the payroll of Vincent Gigante for $800 a week. That's more than most federal judges make. Hoover's face remained expressionless, but his fingers had stopped moving. Agent Robert Sullivan, badge number 3389. 17-year veteran, family man, 3 kids. Also takes photographs of federal surveillance operations and sells them to the Genovese family for $500 per photo. And Agent Donald Morrison, your personal recommendation for the Harlem Task Force. He's been feeding operational details to Carmine Galante for 6 months. Every raid you've planned, every wiretap you've authorized, every safe house you've established. They knew about it 3 days in advance. Bumpy sat down without being invited. Open the envelope, Mr. Director. Hoover's hands were steady as he opened the envelope, but Bumpy noticed the slight tension in his jaw. Inside were photographs that would end careers and start prison sentences, bank deposit slips, hotel receipts, phone records. But the real prize was at the bottom, a reel-to-reel tape recording. That's Agent Kellerman discussing next week's raid on the Apollo Theater with Vincent Gigante, Bumpy explained. Recorded last Tuesday at Romano's restaurant on Mulberry Street. Amazing what you can pick up with the right equipment in the right hands. Hoover stared at the tape for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes held something Bumpy had never seen before. Respect. How long have you known? About the corruption? 3 months. About the plan to let the Italians take Harlem and then sweep them up? 3 weeks. About Agent Chen being my informant? You still don't know about that one. Hoover's eyebrows rose slightly. Agent Chen? Sarah Chen. Organized Crime Division. Brilliant woman. Harvard Law. You hired her yourself. Also the closest thing I have to a daughter. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the traffic sounds from Pennsylvania Avenue seemed to have stopped. For 8 years, Agent Chen has been feeding me information about federal operations, Bumpy continued. Not enough to compromise investigations, just enough to keep me alive. You see, Mr. Director, the game isn't about crime and punishment. It's about survival and respect. Hoover leaned back in his chair. What do you want, Johnson? I want you to listen to a story about a young black man who came to Harlem with nothing but pride and intelligence, who built an empire not through violence but through discipline and loyalty, who kept the peace on the streets when the police couldn't, who made sure the numbers runners' children had food and the policy bank's profits went back into the community. Bumpy's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. I want you to understand that I never sold drugs to children, never allowed prostitution in school zones, never let violence spill over into the churches or the hospitals. I ran a business, Mr. Director, a illegal business, but a business with rules. And now? Now the Italians want to take over. They don't care about rules. They don't care about community. They see Harlem as territory to be conquered, not people to be protected. And your corrupt agents are helping them do it. Hoover studied the photographs again. Assuming I believe you, what's your proposal? I'm 60 years old, Bumpy said. I've been fighting this war for 40 years. I'm tired, but I'm not going to hand over my life's work to men who would destroy everything I've built. He stood up and walked to the window. Below, Washington, D.C., stretched out in all directions. Power and corruption and compromise as far as the eye could see. I want immunity for my operations. Full immunity. In exchange, I'll give you every piece of evidence you need to destroy the Genovese family's operations in New York. Names, dates, locations, financial records, everything. And your corrupt agents? That's your problem to solve. But I'd suggest you solve it quickly. Because if word gets out that the FBI has been compromised, it won't just be your job on the line. It'll be your legacy. Hoover was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. You realize what you're asking me to do. Make a deal with a known criminal. Grant immunity to someone who's broken federal law for decades. I'm asking you to choose, Bumpy said simply. Work with someone who's built something, or watch everything burn while your own agents profit from the chaos. The intercom buzzed. Mr. Director, you have a call from the Attorney General. Hoover looked at the device, then at Bumpy, then at the photograph spread across his desk. Tell the Attorney General I'll call him back, he said. He stood up and walked to his private safe. From inside, he pulled out a file marked Operation Harlem Sweep, Eyes Only. This operation was supposed to begin next week, he said, placing the file on his desk. Coordinated raids on 17 locations, 300 agents, complete federal takeover of organized crime in Harlem. Bumpy glanced at the file but didn't touch it. Supposed to? That depends on what else you have to offer. What I have to offer, Mr. Director, is something your federal agents can't give you. Something your wiretaps can't provide. Something your raids can't accomplish. Which is? Peace, order, stability. A Harlem where the real criminals, the ones who prey on children and destroy communities, can't operate because someone with actual power won't let them. Hoover closed the file. You're proposing a partnership. I'm proposing respect for reality. You can't control the streets from Washington. You can't build trust from behind a badge. You can't understand Harlem from the outside looking in. The phone rang again. This time, Hoover ignored it completely. 30 minutes, he said finally. Give me 30 minutes to make some calls. Then we'll discuss terms. Bumpy nodded and moved toward the door. As his hand touched the handle, Hoover spoke again. Johnson, how do I know you won't betray me the same way you're betraying the Italians? Bumpy turned back, and for the first time since entering the office, he smiled. Because, Mr. Director, I've never betrayed anyone who kept their word to me. And in 40 years on the streets, do you know how many people have kept their word? How many? You're about to find out. The door closed behind him, and J. Edgar Hoover sat alone in his office, staring at evidence that could destroy careers, topple crime families, and rewrite the balance of power in New York City. But what bothered him most wasn't the corruption or the betrayal, or even the audacity of Bumpy Johnson walking into his office. What bothered him was that for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure who was really in control of the conversation. 30 minutes felt like 30 hours. Bumpy Johnson sat in the FBI waiting room, watching federal agents pretend not to stare at him. They whispered behind files and shot nervous glances in his direction. He understood their confusion. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. Crime bosses didn't make appointments with FBI directors, they got arrested by them. But Bumpy had learned something during his years in Alcatraz that most criminals never figured out. The system wasn't designed to destroy smart criminals. It was designed to control stupid ones. Through the frosted glass, he could see Hoover's silhouette moving back and forth. Phone calls were being made, files were being pulled, careers were being decided. At exactly 3:47 p.m., the door opened. Mr. Johnson, the director will see you again. This time, Hoover wasn't alone. A woman in a dark suit stood beside his desk, her Asian features composed and professional. Special Agent Sarah Chen looked at Bumpy with the practiced neutrality of someone trained to hide emotions. Agent Chen, Hoover said, has been filling me in on some interesting details about organized crime operations in Harlem. Bumpy nodded at Sarah but said nothing. In the game they were about to play, even acknowledgement could be dangerous. She tells me you've been quite helpful in identifying irregularities in federal operations. Agent Chen is an exceptional investigator, Bumpy replied carefully. I'm sure she's told you everything you need to know. Hoover walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. The 3 agents you identified have been placed under surveillance. Preliminary evidence suggests your information is accurate. I'm glad to hear it. However, there's a problem with your proposal. Bumpy waited. In negotiations like this, whoever spoke first lost. Full immunity for your operations would require approval from the Attorney General, possibly the President himself. That kind of decision takes time you may not have. Sarah spoke for the first time. Intelligence suggests the Genovese family is accelerating their timeline. The hits on your operations weren't random probes. They were preparation for a full takeover. When? Bumpy asked. Tomorrow night, Hoover said, turning from the window. Coordinated strikes on 12 locations. Your headquarters, your numbers banks, your key personnel. They plan to eliminate your entire operation in a single evening. The room fell silent. Through the windows, Washington, D.C. continued its business. unaware that the balance of power in America's most important city was being negotiated in a federal office. They have inside information, Sarah added quietly. Exact addresses, security details, even your personal schedule for tomorrow evening. Bumpy's expression didn't change, but his mind was racing. Only 6 people knew his full schedule. 3 were dead, 2 were in prison. The 6th. Frank, he said quietly. Frank Lucas has been feeding information to the Genovese family for 3 weeks, Sarah confirmed. We have photographs of him meeting with their representatives. Bank records showing payments of $50,000. It hit Bumpy like a physical blow. Frank Lucas, his protege, his chosen successor, the young man he'd treated like a son. But more than betrayal, it was confirmation of something Bumpy had suspected for months. The game was changing. The old rules of loyalty and respect were dying. A new generation was coming up that cared more about money than honor. There's something else, Hoover said, returning to his desk. Our surveillance of Agent Morrison picked up additional intelligence. The Genovese family isn't planning to stop with you. He opened a new file. After they eliminate your organization, they intend to target every independent black operation in New York, policy banks in Brooklyn, numbers runners in the Bronx, even legitimate businesses owned by people who used to work with you. Scorched earth, Bumpy murmured. Exactly. They're not just taking over territory. They're eliminating competition. Permanently. Bumpy stood and walked to the bookshelf. Titles on law, order, and federal procedure lined the shelves. Books written by men who understood power but had never lived on the streets. What do you need from me? He asked. Everything, Sarah said. Names, locations, financial records, operational details. But most importantly, we need you to help us catch them in the act. You want me to walk into their trap. We want you to spring your own trap, Hoover corrected, with full federal backup. Bumpy turned to face them. And if something goes wrong, if your corrupt agents tip them off, if their information is better than yours, then you'll die, Hoover said bluntly. But if you run, if you try to disappear, they'll hunt you down anyway. At least this way, you have a chance to take them with you. Some choice. It's the only choice, Sarah said softly. Unless you have a better plan. Bumpy smiled for the first time since entering the building. As a matter of fact, I do. He returned to his chair and leaned forward. The Genovese family thinks they're hunting me, but they've made the same mistake every enemy I've ever faced has made. Which is, they think I'm playing their game, but I've been playing a different game entirely. From his jacket, Bumpy pulled out a second envelope. This one was thicker than the first. For the past 6 months, I've been documenting every meeting, every payment, every conversation I've had with federal agents, not just the corrupt ones. All of them. Hoover's eyes narrowed. Are you threatening to expose federal operations? I'm offering to legitimize them. This envelope contains detailed records of my cooperation with federal authorities. Dates, times, intelligence provided, crimes prevented. A complete record of how my organization has been working with the FBI to maintain order in Harlem. That's creative, Sarah said. It's also true. Every piece of information I've provided has prevented violence. Every tip I've given has stopped crimes. Every accommodation I've made has protected innocent people. Bumpy placed the envelope on Hoover's desk. What I'm proposing isn't just immunity, it's partnership. Official partnership. The FBI doesn't partner with criminals. The FBI partners with informants, with confidential sources, with people who provide valuable intelligence in exchange for consideration. Hoover opened the envelope and began reading. His eyebrows rose as he scanned the documents. This is comprehensive. It's also just the beginning. If the Genovese family takes over Harlem, you'll lose the most valuable intelligence asset you've ever had in organized crime. Someone who understands the streets, who can predict violence before it happens, who can keep the peace without federal intervention. And in exchange, I continue to operate under federal supervision, with regular reports, with complete transparency about major decisions, but I operate. Sarah looked at Hoover, then at Bumpy. There's still the matter of tomorrow night. Even if the director agrees to this arrangement, the Genovese family still plans to eliminate you. Let them try, Bumpy said quietly. They have superior numbers, superior firepower, inside information. They have those things, Bumpy agreed, but they don't have what I have. Which is? Bumpy stood and walked to the door. As his hand touched the handle, he turned back. 40 years of surviving by being smarter than everyone who wanted me dead. Tomorrow night, Vincent Gigante and his people are going to learn why I'm still here, while stronger men are buried in Potter's Fields. He opened the door, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Director, Agent Chen, you might want to have your surveillance teams in position early tomorrow evening. I have a feeling it's going to be a very educational night for federal law enforcement. The door closed behind him, leaving Hoover and Sarah staring at each other. Do you think he has a real plan? Sarah asked. Hoover looked at the photographs, the documents. The evidence of corruption and betrayal spread across his desk. I think, he said slowly, that we're about to find out why Bumpy Johnson has survived 40 years in the most dangerous game in America. Outside in the hallway, Bumpy Johnson walked toward the elevator with the measured pace of a man who had just set the biggest trap of his life. But as the elevator doors closed, his reflection showed something his enemies would never expect to see. He wasn't worried. He wasn't scared. He was smiling. Because tomorrow night, when the Genovese family came for him, they would discover that the old man from Harlem had one final lesson to teach about the difference between power and wisdom. Friday, October 18, 1963. 11:47 p.m. The Cotton Club sat empty except for shadows and cigarette smoke. Bumpy Johnson arrived exactly on time, just as he had every Friday night for the past 15 years. But tonight was different. Tonight, death was waiting in the wings. Vincent, the Chin Gigante's men were already in position. 12 shooters spread throughout the club. Professional killers who'd driven up from Little Italy with one job: make sure the King of Harlem never saw Saturday morning. Frank Lucas stood behind the bar, his hands shaking as he polished the same glass for the 10th time. His Judas money was burning a hole in his pocket, but it was too late for regret now. The Italians owned him. They owned his debts, his secrets, and his soul. You sure the old man's coming? Asked Tony Salerno, Gigante's lieutenant, checking his watch. Frank nodded, his voice barely a whisper. Bumpy never misses Friday nights. He'll be here. What they didn't know was that Bumpy had been watching them for the past 2 hours from the building across the street. Through high-powered binoculars, he'd counted every gun, identified every face, mapped every exit they'd blocked. But he wasn't looking for a way out. He was looking for confirmation. At exactly midnight, Bumpy Johnson walked through the front door of the Cotton Club like he owned the place. Because he did. Evening, Frank, he said calmly, hanging his coat on the rack by the door. Bit crowded in here tonight. The tension in the room was electric. 12 guns trained on one man, 12 fingers on 12 triggers, but nobody moved, because Vincent Gigante wasn't done talking yet. Bumpy Johnson, Gigante emerged from the shadows, his massive frame filling the doorway to the back office. The great King of Harlem. Doesn't look like much, does he, boys? Nervous laughter from the shooters, but their eyes stayed locked on Bumpy, who hadn't moved from his spot by the door. You know why we're here, old man? I imagine you're here to kill me, Bumpy replied, straightening his cufflinks with the casual air of a man discussing the weather. That's right, your time is up. Harlem belongs to us now, has for weeks actually. We just been letting you play pretend while we took everything that mattered. Gigante walked closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Your numbers, banks? Ours. Your policy operations? Ours. Your protection rackets? All ours. Even your boy Frank here realized which way the wind was blowing. Frank couldn't meet Bumpy's eyes. Shame and fear had turned his face the color of ash. You want to know the best part? Gigante continued. We've been planning this for 6 months. Every move you made, we knew about 3 days early. Every safe house, every meeting, every escape route. We know everything. Not everything, Bumpy said quietly. Gigante laughed. What don't we know, old man? Please enlighten us. That's when Bumpy smiled. and suddenly every man in that room understood they'd made a terrible mistake. "You don't know about Agent Patricia Kellerman," Bumpy said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent club. "Badge number 4471, your inside woman at the FBI, the one who's been feeding you federal information for $800 a week." Gigante's smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" "You don't know that she's been working for me for the past 2 years. Every piece of information she gave you came from me first." The color drained from Gigante's face. "You don't know that I've been feeding you false intelligence for 6 months. Those numbers banks you think you took over, empty shells. Those policy operations you think you control, decoys. The real money, the real operations, the real power. You never even got close." Bumpy reached into his jacket. 6 guns swung toward him, but he moved slowly, deliberately. "And you don't know about this." He pulled out a small tape recorder and placed it on the bar. "Frank, would you mind playing this for our guests?" Frank's hands were shaking so badly he could barely press the play button. But when he did, Vincent Gigante's own voice filled the Cotton Club. "We kill the old Negro tonight. Then we eliminate every black operation in New York. Scorched earth. No witnesses, no survivors, no loose ends." The tape continued, Gigante discussing bribing federal agents, planning the murder of a federal judge, ordering hits on civilian witnesses. "That recording," Bumpy said calmly, "along with photographs, bank records, and testimony from 3 federal agents, is currently in the possession of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover." Gigante's face had gone from pale to gray. "You're bluffing." "Am I? Frank, what time is it?" Frank glanced at the clock behind the bar. 12:03 a.m. 3 minutes past midnight, Bumpy nodded, "which means it's officially Saturday, October 19th, which means Operation Harlem Sweep just began." As if summoned by his words, the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, getting closer, getting louder. "What Operation Harlem Sweep?" Gigante demanded. "The largest coordinated federal raid in New York history. 17 locations, 300 federal agents, complete federal takeover of organized crime operations throughout the city." The sirens were close now, very close. Every Genovese family's safe house, every illegal operation, every corrupt official on your payroll. They have warrants, Vincent. They have evidence. And they have targets. Bumpy walked slowly toward the center of the room. None of the gunmen moved. They were too busy listening to the sirens that seemed to be coming from every direction. "You see, while you were planning to kill me, I was planning to eliminate your entire family's operations in New York. Permanently." "But how?" Frank whispered. "How did you know we'd be here? How did you know about tonight?" Bumpy looked at his former protege with something that might have been pity. "Frank, you poor greedy fool. I didn't know you'd be here. I arranged for you to be here." "What?" "Every piece of intelligence you sold to the Italians came from me. Every meeting location, every operational detail, every piece of inside information. I've been controlling this game for 6 months." The truth hit Frank like a physical blow. You knew I betrayed you? I knew the day you took their money. I also knew you weren't strong enough to be what this business requires. So I used your weakness to destroy my enemies. The first federal agents burst through the front door, then the back door, then the kitchen entrance. Suddenly, the Cotton Club was filled with men in dark suits carrying badges and guns. "Vincent Gigante," Special Agent Sarah Chen announced, her voice carrying the authority of the federal government. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering, murder, and corruption of federal officers." As the handcuffs clicked around Gigante's wrists, he stared at Bumpy in shock and rage. "This isn't over, Johnson." "Yes, it is," Bumpy replied quietly. "Your family's New York operations are finished. Your corrupt agents are in custody. Your plans are evidence in federal court. And your reputation? Well, word's going to spread fast about how easily you were outplayed by one old man from Harlem." As the federal agents led Gigante and his men away, Frank Lucas stood alone behind the bar, staring at the man who'd been his mentor, his father figure, and ultimately, his judge and jury. "What happens to me?" Frank asked. Bumpy put on his coat and straightened his tie. "That depends on what you do next, Frank. The FBI is going to offer you a deal. Testify against the Genovese family and you'll serve 5 years instead of 25. And if I don't, then you'll spend the rest of your life in federal prison, knowing that your greed destroyed not just yourself, but everyone who trusted you. Bumpy walked toward the door, then paused. But here's the thing you never understood, Frank. This was never about money. It was never about territory. It was about respect, about loyalty, about understanding that in this game, your word is the only currency that really matters. And you're just going to walk away? Bumpy smiled one last time. Frank, I'm not walking away. I'm walking into a new partnership with the federal government. Official recognition, legal protection, and the authority to make sure Harlem stays safe from men like Vincent Gigante. You made a deal with the FBI? I made a deal with power, Frank. Real power, the kind that lasts. As Bumpy Johnson stepped out into the New York night, federal agents were executing simultaneous raids across the city. The Genovese family's empire was crumbling in real time, but in Harlem, the king still ruled. Only now he ruled with the full backing of the United States government. 6 months later, Vincent, the Chin Gigante, sat in a federal holding cell at ADX Florence, staring at concrete walls that would be his entire world for the next 40 years. The man who once commanded armies of soldiers from Brooklyn to the Bronx was now prisoner number 47829-054. His empire hadn't just fallen, it had been systematically dismantled piece by piece by a 60-year-old man who'd never needed to fire a single shot. The numbers told the story. 17 simultaneous federal raids, 32 arrests, 12 life sentences without parole, assets worth $14 million seized and redistributed to victims' families. The Genovese family's New York operations didn't just end, they were erased from history. But for Gigante, the real punishment wasn't the concrete cell or the orange jumpsuit. It was lying awake every night, knowing he'd been outplayed by someone he'd dismissed as a relic from a bygone era. Frank Lucas took the federal deal. 5 years in minimum security in exchange for testimony that destroyed what remained of organized crime in Harlem. He served 3 years and 8 months before disappearing into witness protection with a new name and the crushing weight of his betrayal. Years later, in a prison interview, Frank would say, "I thought I was playing chess with Bumpy. Turns out he was playing three-dimensional chess while I was still learning checkers. The man was thinking moves ahead that I couldn't even see." The corrupt federal agents faced their own justice. Patricia Kellerman received 25 years for selling federal secrets. Robert Sullivan got 18 years and lost his pension. Donald Morrison received life without parole when investigators discovered he'd been compromising federal operations for over a decade, leading to the deaths of 3 undercover agents. But the most shocking revelation came during Morrison's trial. FBI forensic accountants discovered that every piece of intelligence he'd sold had been carefully crafted by Bumpy Johnson himself. For 2 years, Morrison had been unknowingly feeding the Genovese family false information, making them believe they were winning a war they'd already lost. J. Edgar Hoover would later call it the most sophisticated counterintelligence operation ever conducted by a civilian. And Bumpy Johnson? He became something unprecedented in American law enforcement history. On November 15, 1963, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson signed the first and only consulting contract between the FBI and a former crime boss. His official title was Senior Consultant for Urban Crime Prevention and Community Relations. His annual salary was $75,000, more than most federal judges earned. His real power was immeasurable. For the next 5 years, until his death from a heart attack in 1968, Bumpy Johnson ran Harlem with the full backing of the United States government. Crime rates dropped 60%. Street violence virtually disappeared. Drug trafficking was reduced to isolated incidents handled swiftly and quietly. But more importantly, Bumpy created something that had never existed before, a partnership between federal law enforcement and urban communities based on mutual respect rather than fear. He established the Harlem Community Safety Initiative, which trained local residents to work with federal agents in identifying real threats while protecting innocent people from harassment. He created job programs that gave former criminals legitimate opportunities to earn respect through honest work. He built a network of informants who provided intelligence not for money, but because they believed in keeping their neighborhood safe. Special Agent Sarah Chen, who was promoted to assistant director partly based on her work with Bumpy, would later write in her memoir, "He taught us that law enforcement isn't about controlling people, it's about earning the right to protect them." The partnership worked so well that other cities tried to replicate it. Chicago reached out to longtime Southside boss Sam Giancana. Detroit approached the Purple Gang's leadership. Los Angeles contacted Mickey Cohen. None of those arrangements lasted more than 6 months, because none of those men possessed what Bumpy Johnson had built over 40 years, genuine respect from the people he protected. When Bumpy died on July 7, 1968, his funeral was attended by over 3,000 people. Congressmen sat next to former criminals. FBI agents served as honorary pallbearers alongside numbers runners and policy bank operators. The mayor of New York gave a eulogy that praised Bumpy's unwavering commitment to his community. But perhaps the most telling tribute came from Vincent Gigante himself, who managed to send a message from federal prison. "I spent my whole life thinking respect came from fear. Bumpy Johnson taught me it comes from earning it. I hated him, but I respected him more than any man I ever met." Euchre, the lessons of Bumpy Johnson's life became required reading at FBI training academies. His methods are still studied by federal agents learning to work in urban environments. His philosophy, that real power comes from serving people rather than controlling them, became the foundation of modern community policing. Today in Harlem, there's a small plaque on the corner of 116th Street and Lenox Avenue. It reads, "Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 1905-1968. He proved that intelligence is more powerful than violence, that loyalty is more valuable than money, and that respect must be earned every single day." But the real legacy of Bumpy Johnson isn't carved in bronze. It's in the understanding that the most dangerous person in any room isn't the one with the biggest gun or the loudest voice. It's the one who's been thinking 3 moves ahead while everyone else is still trying to understand the game. Vincent Gigante learned that lesson too late. Frank Lucas learned it at the cost of his soul. The corrupt federal agents learned it at the cost of their freedom. But Bumpy Johnson had learned it 40 years earlier, in the streets of Harlem, where survival depended on being smarter, more patient, and more strategic than everyone who wanted you dead. In the end, that's what separated the king of Harlem from every challenger who thought they could take his crown. He didn't just play the game better than everyone else. He changed the rules.